Um, Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of physical precision, you know?
Right, yeah. Like it should be black and white.
Exactly. It feels like mechanical engineering almost. Like
Yeah.
you break your arm, you go to the hospital, the X-ray machine hums, and a monitor displays this stark, jagged white line across your radius.
And the doctor simply points at the screen and says, there's the problem.
Yeah, it's a completely visual binary confirmation. It's either broken or not broken.
We find tremendous psychological comfort in that visibility, actually. I mean, the human brain craves categorization.
Oh, sure.
Seeing that physical break allows the patient to instantly comprehend the trauma and, more importantly, they understand the necessary intervention. You put a cast on it, keep it still, let the bone knit. The mechanism is totally transparent.
Right, but the moment you step out of the orthopedic ward and into internal medicine, and specifically into the landscape of chronic, invisible conditions or genetic predispositions, that comforting clarity just vanishes.
Oh, completely. It's a totally different world.
We don't have the luxury of a jagged white line on a screen anymore. We enter this diagnostic environment where the symptoms are episodic, the triggers are environmental, and the underlying causes are written in like microscopic genetic code.
It's a profound shift. You're moving from structural damage to systemic vulnerability. The medical inquiry basically moves from what is broken to how is the body misinterpreting its environment.
And that systemic vulnerability is the exact focal point of our deep dive today. Because you, our listener, brought a really fascinating and deeply layered stack of sources to our table.
Yeah, it's a brilliant set of documents.
Your core inquiry was seemingly straightforward on the surface, right? You asked, what is asthma? Is asthma genetic? And you provided this document with an incredibly evocative title to frame it, Breathless Inheritance, the Biological Roots of Asthma.
I mean, that title alone performs a huge heavy lift, semantically speaking.
It really does. Yet the text beneath that title threw us a massive curveball.
Yeah.
Because we opened your source material expecting, a standard physiological breakdown of the respiratory system.
Right, like diagrams of lungs, definitions of wheezing, a list of genetic markers, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But instead, the document is this intricate, behind-the-scenes blueprint of the framework of medical information itself.
Which was so unexpected.
It really was.
Yeah.
The sources focus heavily on how independent medical platforms, specifically a platform called iMedix, how they research, curate, structure, and deliver data about medication safety and patient education to the public.
And at first glance, I mean, it feels like two completely different topics, doesn't it?
It really does. Like, what does database curation have to do with my breathing?
Right. But examining the framework of how medical info is built is actually the only way to decode a question as complex as the biological roots of asthma. We can't untangle the disease without understanding the lens through which we're viewing it.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today is to merge these two concepts. We're going to explore your primary question about the biology of asthma, what airway inflammation actually is, how genes and environment collide.
The clinical stuff, yeah.
Right. But we're going to use that biological reality as our running case study to understand the architecture of medical literacy.
Yeah.
Because, as your sources explicitly warn, the general public fundamentally misunderstands basic medication risks.
Consistently. It's a huge issue.
So we have to map out the ecosystem of patient education, these massive drug databases, and the critical role of independent medical translation.
Because framing the biological question through the lens of data interpretation is essential. Raw biological data is practically useless without context.
Absolutely. So I want to start by dissecting that frame, and let's look at the specific phrasing of the title you provided. Breathless Inheritance, the Biological Roots of Asthma.
It's so striking.
It is. Using the word inheritance rather than clinical terms like pathology or syndrome or chronic respiratory disease, that is a very deliberate choice. It completely overhauls the psychological paradigm of the patient reading it.
Well, pathology sounds sterile, right? It isolates the condition. It frames it as a random glitch in an otherwise functioning machine. It implies an isolated failure. But an editorial team choosing the word inheritance, they pull the condition out of isolation.
They're framing a clinical condition not as an anomaly, but as a legacy passed down through generations.
Exactly. It anchors the condition to a lineage. So instead of patient thinking, why is my body failing me randomly, they begin to think, how does my family history dictate my current reality?
That is a huge semantic shift. It moves the patient from a state of victimhood into a state of historical context.
And we are storytelling creatures, ultimately. The concept of biological roots gives a narrative structure to what feels like chaos.
Like when a parent is watching their kids struggle to pull air into their lungs.
Right, staring at a wall of clinical jargon about bronchial hyperreactivity in an emergency room is totally alienating. But validating the instinct to look at the family tree makes the underlying science way more accessible.
Let's actually define that underlying science for a minute, just so we understand what is being inherited.
Yeah.
When we talk about the biological roots of asthma, we're talking about a chronic inflammation of the airways, right?
Fundamentally, yes. The immune system is essentially overreacting to stimuli.
But I have to push back on the inheritance framing for a second.
Mm.
If we heavily label a condition like asthma as an inheritance, do we risk inducing fatalism?
That'd be mean.
Well, you can't return an inheritance. You're stuck with it. So does emphasizing the genetic roots inadvertently minimize the critical importance of daily management or, like, environmental triggers?
Oh, I see what you're saying. But actually acknowledging the inheritance directs the intervention. It doesn't remove your agency. It establishes your baseline.
Okay, lay that out for me.
Asthma is basically the classic textbook example of how genetics and environment interact. The inheritance is not a guarantee of the disease. It is the inheritance of a susceptibility.
So, meaning the genes load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger.
That is a very apt way to put it, yeah. The genetic component dictates the potential for bronchial hyperreactivity.
Wait, bronchial hyperreactivity, what exactly is happening physically there?
It's the tendency of the smooth muscles around your airways to constrict really easily. It's a physical spasm. But whether that hyperreactivity turns into a full-blown asthma attack depends almost entirely on environmental factors.
Things like what?
Exposure to allergens like dust mites or pet dander, or air pollution, sudden changes in weather, and heavily respiratory infections during early childhood.
Oh, childhood patterns play a big role.
A massive role. Frequent viral lung infections when you're young can kind of permanently alter how your immune system responds to everyday irritants later on.
So if a platform like iMedix is explaining these genetic predispositions, they aren't doing it to say, hey, there's nothing you can do.
Not at all.
They're explaining the baseline to highlight why controlling the environment is so crucial. Like if you know you have the biological roots, you know you have to be super vigilant about those triggers.
Furthermore, understanding the specific biological root dictates your medication strategy. Because asthma is not a monolith.
It's not just one disease.
Well, it presents similarly, but the drivers are different. An inherited tendency for allergic asthma, which is driven by IgE antibodies reacting to pollen or whatever, requires a completely different pharmacological approach than non-allergic asthma.
What triggers non-allergic asthma?
Things like intense exercise or just breathing in cold air. The inheritance is a map. It basically tells the patient, here is your unique biological landscape. Now here is the specific tool set required to navigate it safely.
Which brings up a massive logistical hurdle in my mind.
Yeah.
Translating these incredibly dense biological concepts, IgE antibodies, smooth muscle constriction, genetic susceptibility into practical advice that a regular patient can actually use requires a really specialized intermediary.
Oh, absolutely.
You can't just hand a patient their raw genetic sequence and a list of chemical compounds and expect them to safely manage a chronic disease.
The translation of raw medical data into actionable patient education is probably the most valuable currency in public health today.
And that necessity brings us to the core structural focus of your sources. The document repeatedly highlights platforms like iMedix, describing them as independent medical information platforms.
Right. Backed by dual teams.
Yes, an editorial team and a medical research team. But I want to scrutinize that word for a second. Independent. In the modern healthcare landscape, what does true independence actually look like?
That's the million-dollar question.
Why is it the bedrock of this whole framework?
Well, we exist in a medical information ecosystem that is heavily compromised by competing interests. A patient searching for info on their asthma inheritance is basically navigating a minefield.
Because of advertising.
Exactly. They are bombarded by pharmaceutical advertising disguised as education. There's sponsored content paid for by inhaler manufacturers and search engine algorithms that are optimized to promote the most profitable interventions, not necessarily the most appropriate ones.
To put this in perspective for the listener, imagine trying to evaluate the quality of a restaurant, but the only reviews available to read are written by the chefs who cook the food.
Right, they're inherently biased.
The chef is never going to tell you the soup is cold or the fish is undercooked. Every meal will be described as flawless. You desperately need an independent food critic, someone whose paycheck does not depend on you buying that specific meal to tell you the objective truth about the menu.
And the independent medical platform serves as that critic. True independence means the platform's loyalty is to the accuracy of the data and the literacy of the patient.
Divorced from revenue.
Entirely divorced from a pharmaceutical company's need to hit quarterly targets. If an asthma medication is highly effective at reducing airway inflammation, but carries a severe risk of psychiatric side effects for patients with specific genetic profiles, the manufacturer's promotional material might bury that.
Well, they'll put it in microscopic font on page 12 of a dense pamphlet.
Exactly. But the independent platform pulls that risk to the front page, bolds it, and explains exactly why it happens.
They separate the science from the sales pitch.
Yes, but achieving that separation requires the specific dual team structure mentioned in your sources. You need the medical research team and the editorial team working in perfect symbiosis.
Okay, why are both necessary, though? If independence and accuracy are the goals, why not just employ a team of doctors and biochemists to write all the articles directly for the public? Cut out the middleman.
Because the skill required to decode clinical data is fundamentally different from the skill required to communicate it.
Oh, so?
The medical research team are the data miners. They are the ones analyzing the double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. They're reading the peer-reviewed studies on leukotriene modifiers, calculating p-values, looking at the raw pharmacokinetics of how a specific molecule binds to a receptor in the lung.
That is the hard, cold science.
But hard, cold science is practically a foreign language to someone without a medical degree. If a researcher hands a parent a 50-page clinical trial summary detailing the molecular binding affinity of an inhaled corticosteroid,
the parent gains zero practical knowledge.
They are completely paralyzed by the density of the information. That's the critical failure point of raw data. It's totally inaccessible.
Enter the editorial team.
Exactly. The editorial team performs the translation. They take that molecular binding affinity data and ask, how do we make this actionable? How do we structure this so a terrified parent understands exactly how to administer this inhaler to prevent an attack without triggering a secondary side effect?
They provide the narrative structure.
The structure, the clarity, the pacing. The researchers ensure the information is medically bulletproof, and the editorial team ensures it is humanly digestible.
But the editorial team is essentially flying blind if they don't have access to comprehensive instant data, right?
Yeah.
They can't manually read 10,000 clinical trials every time they write an article.
No, it would take lifetimes. They need a massive technological engine powering their research.
Which brings us to the proprietary drug database referenced heavily in the source material.
Yeah.
When the text says platforms like iMedix rely on a drug database combined with educational resources, we really need to clarify what that database actually is, because the word database sounds kind of mundane.
It sounds like an Excel spreadsheet.
Right. Or like a digital phone book of pill names and dosages.
But it's vastly more complex than a list. A modern drug database is a staggering, living architectural feat of relational data. It maps billions of potential intersections.
The intersections of what?
It catalogs not just the active chemical compounds of every approved medication, but the metabolic pathways those compounds take through the human body.
Okay, let's use our running case study of asthma to visualize this for the listener. Say a patient is prescribed a really common rescue inhaler like albuterol. What is the database doing behind the scenes with that single medication?
Okay, so the database logs that albuterol is a beta-2 adrenergic agonist, meaning it works by relaxing the smooth muscles surrounding the airways.
Reversing that bronchial hyperreactivity we talked about earlier.
Exactly. But that is just the first layer. The database then cross-references albuterol against thousands of other variables.
Like what?
How does it interact with an over-the-counter cold medicine the patient might take? How does it interact with dietary factors, like high caffeine intake? How does it perform in a patient who also has an underlying cardiac condition? Because relaxing smooth muscle can also elevate your heart rate.
So it's kind of like a global air traffic control system.
But great analogy.
Air traffic control doesn't just track one airplane. It tracks the altitude, speed, and trajectory of thousands of planes simultaneously. If one plane changes its course due to a storm, the system has to instantly calculate how that change affects the flight paths of 50 other planes to prevent a mid-air collision.
And the drug database is mapping chemical collisions in the body.
Down to a molecular level, right?
Yes. Consider the cytochrome P450 enzyme system in the liver. This system is responsible for metabolizing the vast majority of medications you take. The database tracks exactly which specific enzyme, say CYP3A4, is required to break down a specific daily asthma controller medication.
And what if the patient takes a different drug for an entirely separate issue that happens to inhibit that specific liver enzyme?
Then the asthma medication is no longer broken down efficiently. It builds up in the bloodstream, turning a safe therapeutic dose into a potentially toxic one. The database instantly flags that enzyme collision.
That level of tracking is just breathtaking. But it brings me to a structural question.
Sure.
If this master air traffic control system exists, and it has all this incredibly precise interaction data,
Yeah.
why do we need the editorial platforms at all?
I see where you're going.
Why write articles or produce educational resources? Shouldn't the data speak for itself? Just give the patient a login to the database and let them search for their own drug interactions.
Because data never speaks for itself. Raw data is entirely mute without context.
Mute without context.
Oh.
Explain that.
If you give a patient unfiltered access to raw database output, they're going to type in their asthma medication and receive a flat, unweighted list of like 300 potential side effects.
Oh, wow.
And the list will range from a mild headache to spontaneous cardiovascular failure.
And they'll all look equally likely.
Yes. The database lists all of them because, statistically, they have all occurred in a clinical setting over decades of observation.
But the database isn't telling a story. It's just a raw dump of facts.
Exactly. Raw data cannot differentiate between a side effect that occurs in 1 out of 10 people and a side effect that occurs in 1 out of 10 million people. To the untrained eye, looking at a raw list, all risks appear equal.
Which is terrifying.
It is. That is why the source material insists that the drug database must be combined with educational resources. The educational component provides the necessary weighting. It explains the likelihood of the side effect and, crucially, the mechanism behind it.
So if a patient understands the why, the fear dissipates.
Usually, yeah.
Like, if an editorial platform explains that the inhaler mimics a natural stress hormone to force the lungs open, the patient understands why their hands might shake slightly after taking it.
Exactly. They realize the tremor is an expected mechanical byproduct of the drug working, not a sign that they are being poisoned.
Contextualizing risk is the only way to prevent panic.
And preventing panic is literally a matter of life and death, which leads us directly into the core crisis identified in your sources.
Yes. The text explicitly states that people often misunderstand medication risks, and that this fundamental misunderstanding is why platforms examining regulatory and warning contexts are so vital.
It's arguably one of the most dangerous barriers in modern public health.
Why is the general public so inherently bad at calculating medical risk, though? Is it just a lack of scientific vocabulary, or are we fighting against, like, core human psychology?
It's deeper than vocabulary. We are just fundamentally incapable of processing statistical probability intuitively. Yeah, it's deeply rooted in statistical innumeracy. The human brain evolved to assess immediate binary physical threats, a predator in the brush, a fire. We did not evolve to intuitively grasp the nuance between relative risk and absolute risk.
That makes sense.
So when a patient is managing a chronic inheritance like asthma, those statistical blind spots become incredibly dangerous.
I call it the terms and conditions paradox.
Oh, I like that. How does that work?
Well, when we download a new software update on our phones, we're immediately presented with 30 pages of dense legal text.
Right, which nobody reads.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We blindly scroll to the bottom and click accept without reading a single syllable. We're completely apathetic to the risk because it feels abstract and bureaucratic.
Yeah.
But when the risk involves our biology, our lungs, our kids, we swing to the exact opposite extreme. If a doctor hands us a dense pamphlet of potential side effects for a life-saving medication, the sheer volume of warnings can induce such terror that we refuse to take the treatment.
We basically exist in a binary state of either total apathy or total panic.
Yes. And that swing from apathy to panic is exactly why independent platforms must intervene. Because the reality of how those warning labels are generated is often a huge shock to patients.
Oh, it really is.
How so? Like, who writes those warnings?
Well, the official medical warnings, the inserts physically packaged with the medication, mandated by regulatory bodies, are primarily written by corporate lawyers.
Wow. Not medical educators.
No, not at all. They're liability shields.
So it's a legal document, not a health guide.
Essentially, yes. A pharmaceutical manufacturer is legally obligated to list every single contingency, regardless of the statistical improbability, to protect themselves from future
Yes.
lawsuits.
Even if something is insanely rare.
If one patient in a trial of 50,000 experienced a bizarre unrelated symptom, the manufacturer will list it to cover their legal bases. Their primary objective is not to clearly educate the end user, it is to legally bulletproof the corporation.
So the independent educational platform must act as the interpreter of the legal shield.
Yep.
They have to look at this terrifying wall of mandated warnings and translate it into practical reality for the patient standing in the pharmacy.
And they utilize comparative baselines to do this. A well-constructed educational resource will contextualize a terrifying statistical warning by comparing it to an everyday accepted risk.
Let's apply this directly to the asthma focus again, because one of the most terrifying warnings for parents dealing with a kid's inherited asthma is the warning attached to inhaled corticosteroids.
Oh, the growth warning,
Yeah,
yes.
the labels often warn that these daily preventative inhalers can stunt childhood growth. If a parent reads that raw warning, their immediate instinct is panic. I am not giving my child a drug that stunts their growth.
Which is a perfectly rational parental reaction to raw data. But here is how the editorial platform provides the context. They explain the absolute risk versus the relative risk.
Break that down.
The platform will detail that, yes, studies show a slight reduction in growth velocity, perhaps a ½ inch to an inch in total adult height, but they immediately weigh that against the biological alternative.
The alternative being uncontrolled asthma.
Precisely. Uncontrolled asthma leads to chronic sleep deprivation, systemic inflammation, frequent emergency room visits, and severe drops in blood oxygen levels.
Which sounds awful for development.
It is. The educational platform explains that chronic severe asthma itself is known to significantly stunt growth and development, often much more severely than the medication ever could.
So the platform changes the math for the parent. It shifts the perspective from this drug is dangerous to this drug has a measurable, minor trade-off that prevents a catastrophic biological outcome.
The context basically defangs the legal warning. It replaces raw fear with calculated risk management.
Which brings us to a larger philosophical shift discussed in your sources, the evolution of real-world safety and the role of the modern patient. The document emphasizes providing patient education to navigate treatment questions and practical safety implications.
We are looking at a complete overhaul of how patients interact with the healthcare system. We are witnessing the death of the passive patient model.
The passive patient, meaning the historic model where the doctor acts as the absolute authority, hands over a prescription, and the patient just consumes it without asking a single question.
Right, the paternalistic era of medicine. It relied entirely on blind trust.
But blind trust is pretty brittle, isn't it?
Incredibly brittle. The moment a patient experiences an unexpected side effect or reads a terrifying legal warning, that trust shatters and they abandon the treatment.
Which leads to terrible health outcomes.
Today, we are in the era of the proactive patient. And the listener who submitted these sources is the prime example of this.
Absolutely.
They aren't waiting for a doctor to hand them a pamphlet. They are actively investigating the biological roots of bronchial hyperreactivity and interrogating the databases that track medication safety.
If you're the listener doing this research, your instinct to investigate is not just valid, it's a critical component of modern clinical care. Platforms that focus on treatment questions are explicitly designed to give you the vocabulary to have a peer-level dialogue with your doctor.
You're no longer just receiving instruction, you are participating in the strategy.
And does clinical data show that this empowerment actually impacts physical outcomes?
Oh, definitively. It changes outcomes directly through adherence and compliance.
How so?
When a patient truly understands the medical reasoning behind a treatment protocol, their compliance rates increase dramatically. Let's look at one of the most common misconceptions about asthma, the idea of outgrowing it.
Oh, I've heard people say that all the time. I had asthma as a kid, but I outgrew it.
Right. It stems from a profound misunderstanding of reversible airway narrowing.
Reversible airway narrowing. Okay, explain that mechanism.
Asthma is characterized by airways that constrict and inflame, but crucially, that constriction is reversible with medication. This is unlike diseases like COPD, where the damage to the lungs is permanent.
Got it.
So because the narrowing is reversible, a patient will use their daily controller medication, the inflammation will subside, their breathing will normalize, and they will feel completely cured.
So they stop taking the medication. They think, I feel fine, my airways are open, I outgrew it, I don't want to be dependent on an inhaler anyway.
Exactly. And 2 weeks later, the underlying invisible inflammation returns, triggered by a minor allergen resulting in a severe, life-threatening attack. The patient completely misunderstood the mechanism. They thought the absence of symptoms meant the absence of the disease.
No, wow. But if they had utilized an educational resource that clearly explained the biological root.
Yes. If they knew that the genetic susceptibility to inflammation is always present, even when they feel fine, they would understand that the daily medication is a shield, not a cure.
If you understand the biological mechanics of what a dose is achieving behind the scenes, you're exponentially less likely to abandon the medication out of false confidence.
Or unfounded fear. Knowledge directly drives adherence, and adherence prevents hospitalization.
But, okay, we have to address the inherent danger in this proactive model.
I know what you're going to say.
We have all encountered the stereotype of the modern patient who walks into a clinic clutching a stack of printouts from an obscure internet forum, utterly convinced they know more than a specialist who spent 12 years in medical school.
Oh, the I did my own research phenomenon.
Exactly. Is there a tipping point where patient education becomes patient hubris? Can a little knowledge be a dangerous thing if a patient decides to bypass professional medical advice just because they spent an hour querying a drug database?
It is a massive vulnerability in the system. That hubris has led to disastrous clinical outcomes, especially when that research is conducted in echo chambers or using algorithmically biased search engines or conspiratorial forums that lack any scientific rigor.
Because not all information is weighted equally, but the internet presents it as if it is.
Which brings us full circle to why the independent framework, the rigorous editorial standards, and the data-backed architecture we've been discussing are so incredibly vital.
Because they provide the guardrails.
Yes. True medical education, the kind provided by platforms operating with real integrity, does not just teach facts, it teaches context. And a fundamental part of teaching context is teaching the user the limits of their own knowledge.
That is a brilliant distinction. True education eliminates what you don't know.
Exactly. The Dunning-Kruger effect is rampant in medical self-education. A low level of knowledge often produces massive overconfidence, but a quality independent platform actively combats this.
It doesn't try to replace the doctor.
No. Its goal is to foster a highly functional collaboration. It equips the patient with enough foundational knowledge to spot potential drug interactions that a rushed pharmacist might have missed, or to advocate for their specific genetic profile.
Or to ask highly targeted questions during a rushed 15-minute consultation.
Exactly. It upgrades the doctor-patient relationship from a monologue to an informed dialogue.
It is a partnership fundamentally supported by this vast, invisible architecture of data tracking and editorial translation.
Beautifully put.
We have traversed an incredible amount of terrain in this deep dive. We started with your specific inquiry into the biology of asthma, examining what it truly means to possess a breathless inheritance.
We explored how genetic susceptibility collides with environmental triggers to create systemic airway inflammation.
But we used that biological reality to map the larger infrastructure of medical literacy. We examined the absolute necessity of independent platforms separating medical reality from pharmaceutical marketing.
We visualized the staggering complexity of drug databases acting as air traffic control for our metabolisms.
And we highlighted the life-saving mission of editorial teams who translate terrifying legal warnings into practical, actionable risk assessments. We've established how decoding these systems empowers you, the proactive patient, to take control of your biological legacy.
It really does.
But before we conclude, there is one final forward-looking implication we want to leave you with, a concept to mull over that builds on the intersection of your genes and these massive data systems.
It's something we are rapidly approaching. We have spent this time discussing how current platforms decode our biological realities using existing databases and human editorial teams. But we are on the precipice of a massive technological shift.
The AI shift.
Yes. Consider the rapid integration of artificial intelligence into these health databases. What happens when the future of patient education is no longer an article you read, but a real-time algorithmic breakdown of your exact, fully sequenced genetic inheritance?
Instantly cross-referenced against the molecular structure of every drug on the market.
Predicting your exact physical reaction before you even take a pill.
I mean, logically, it sounds like the ultimate optimization of medication safety, the absolute end of trial and error medicine.
Physically, yes, it represents a utopia of personalized medicine. But the question is, Are we psychologically prepared for that level of clarity?
Oh, wow.
If a system can perfectly calculate your absolute biological destiny, mapping exactly which inherited conditions will activate and when, how does that change the way you live your life?
The diagnostic muddy waters of internal medicine might completely clear up, but what is waiting for us at the bottom when the mystery is entirely removed?
It's a heavy thought.
It's a profoundly heavy prospect. When the X-ray machine evolves to the point where it can see not just the broken bone, but the very code of what you are destined to endure, we will need entirely new frameworks of translation just to handle the psychological weight of the truth.
We really will.
Thank you for bringing such a unique, challenging, and meta-level stack of sources to our table. Your inquiry pushed us to look beyond the disease and into the machinery of how we understand it. Keep pulling those threads, keep interrogating the databases, and most importantly, keep asking the big questions. Until next time.